Good morning, everybody. Thank you for your attendance this morning. So let's just jump right into it. So defensive facts, why is this a needed conversation? And so if you happen to be Maricopa County, here's a couple reasons. So one of the images that you're seeing here, there's a relatively innocuous post on social media from this individual. Can anyone make out the router password from the paper on the wall? So for those of you, to give you a little bit of context, what you're seeing is our recorder's office that's responsible for elections has a number of streaming cameras that are on 24/7, trying to encourage transparency and show everybody what's going on at any given moment. And so what you're seeing is actually evidence. We use third-party software to show that this image had been doctored, and somebody less than innocently put a little piece of paper on the back of that wall with a router name and password. I've been in that facility. I can tell you no such paper exists. So this is one of the things that we've dealt with. Another example is one of the things that my team, and we'll talk more about this here in a second, but my team monitors social media on a regular basis, and we do so we can get a better grasp of what the threats to the organization are at any given point. So what you're seeing here are two separate examples. So on your left, basically what you're seeing is a post with, again, same camera infrastructure and questions about what it is that we're doing in terms of our facility. And then on the right, what you're seeing is somebody who is actually staking out our recorder facility where equipment is stored. And basically there was a call out that we saw online basically saying, hey, I'm outside the facility. We see this truck being loaded up with equipment. We believe that it has ballots and other pieces of voting apparatus, if you will, that looks like it's being disposed or taken away from the facility. So in that instance, we actually caught that. We were able to let law enforcement know. Instead of dumping voting machines and things of that sort, actually there were old multifunction printer devices that were being salvaged. And the person that they were following, that truck was being driven by a sheriff's deputy officer. And so that was a situation where that could have easily turned into a physical altercation, because the last time I checked, police departments don't like to be followed. So this is why, from our perspective as Maricopa County, this is a needed conversation as well. And then lastly, to give you some more context, so the image you see with the person that is in the hoodie with their face covered is we had an election staff member. And actually, in this instance, it was pretty sad. This person actually is no longer employed with the county. She had resigned her post, and for, among other reasons, all the threats that she was receiving online. And so her personal information got doxed. And so what you see redacted is the information that was posted online. This individual showed up in the middle of the night. And what you're seeing is her Ring camera catching that. So fortunately, in her instance, she was out of town. She was taking care of a sick family member. But this was in the middle of the night, and then this person banging on their door. Fortunately, nobody was there. Additionally, what you're also seeing is we've had physical intrusions where we've had people dumpster diving, if you will, and trying to piece together looking for evidence of malfeasance, if you will. And then the smaller image on the bottom, for those of you that recall hearing in the news, in 2022, there was a number 2, I believe, ballot drop-box locations where people could drop off their ballots. And they were being staked out with individuals in tactical armor and were also armed as well. And so, anyways, so these are all the things that, unfortunately, Maricopa County has had to deal with. And so as a result, this is why we're so passionate about this. But for those of you that have the fortune of not working for local government or working for Maricopa County, which I believe is everybody in this room, it's not just limited to government. And so false and misleading messages themselves have had an impact on from a financial perspective, reputational perspective, a physical risk perspective, as well as obviously cyber. And so just to give you a little bit of context, if you work for a private organization, obviously you're motivated by money. And I'm not saying that in a negative way, it just is what it is. Misdis and malinformation has had an impact on all of us. And so it just happens to be different flavors, different impacts, different instances, if you will. So now with that out of the way, let me introduce myself. So I am Lester Godsey. I'm the CISO for Maricopa County. And so for those of you not familiar with Maricopa County, by population, we're the 4th largest county in the United States. So our population is right around 4.6 million residents. And so, and really, this whole topic and what we do as an information security team has been born out of necessity. In my wildest dreams, I've been in IT for 27 years, a number of those specifically in cybersecurity. In my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that as I reached the end of my government service, that my focus would be on misdis and malinformation and having a material role within the organization to ensure that people don't get hurt or killed. So, but here we are today. So in terms of what we're going to discuss today, so we just discussed why this is a problem, or at least from Maricopa County's perspective. Some of the other things that I want to discuss with you today is what are the challenges in quantifying misdis and malinformation risk, which is an interesting problem. We'll also discuss why reducing mean time to discovery with MDM is so difficult, and then what we as organizations can do. So I want to share with you some of the things that Maricopa County is doing along those lines. Not all of that will necessarily translate to your respective organizations, but hopefully it'll get the thought going if it's not already a topic of discussion within your organization. I'll summarize some of the more salient points that I'm hoping that you will take away from the discussion today. And then hopefully we'll have some time for questions. And along those lines, if we have more questions than we have time, we'll go to a wrap-up room or a location where we can have some follow-up conversations as well. So quantifying MDM. And so all of us as cybersecurity professionals, we're well-versed of the industry standards, the existing frameworks with regards to how we measure risk from a cybersecurity perspective. We could talk about NIST, we could talk about FAIR, CVSS scores, right? So when you see a vulnerability that's released, you see a number. You know exactly what that means. You know how that was derived. And so it becomes second nature to us. Unfortunately, from our perspective and based off of the research we've done, having an equivalent in terms of measuring risk from an information service, specifically with traditional or social media platforms, is non-existent. And so in traditional cybersecurity, you can even apply certain statistical methods like the Monte Carlo analysis method. And before we get too far into this, just for sake of transparency, I never took statistics. I managed to talk my way out of that when I was working on my master's degree. So thank goodness for Google. But so let's use the Monte Carlo method, though, just as an example, and you'll see why here in a second. So there's really 3 basic steps along these lines. So you create the predictive model, identifying dependent and independent variables. And so this will be critical in our conversation as we try to quantify risk for misdis and malinformation. Then we determine the probability distributions of those said variables. And then you run the Monte Carlo simulations enough where you get a good representative sample, if you will. And so, okay, so this is not intended to be a statistical conversation, but why am I bringing this up in the first place? So here's where the difficulty is. The independent variable in question here is the risk or the predictor variables around misdis and malinformation. So what are we talking about? So what variables are we using to predict misdis and malinformation? So that in itself is a huge problem and a huge challenge. So if you're fortunate enough, you can use historical data in specifying that probability distribution. But I don't know about you, and again, just being transparent with you, I have a difficult enough time in aggregating and collecting historical data about more traditional cyber risk we have in the first place, let alone the ability and actually being able to collect the data points on risk as it relates to dis, and malinformation on social media. So that in itself is a huge challenge with regards to this topic at hand. And really, the bottom line is, if you don't have those data collection points in the first place, so your processes aren't set up in such a way where you're accurately and consistently collecting those data points, pretty much your analysis is going to be subjective, based off of your analyst's perspective, qualitative in nature as opposed to quantitative, and frankly inconsistent. Okay, so specifically around dis, and malinformation, we all know how risk is calculated. Risk equals the likelihood of an event occurring times the impact of said event occurring, right? And so that's the basis of how CBSS scores are structured and all those frameworks that I mentioned as well. But when you apply that question to dis, and malinformation, what are we measuring in terms of likelihood when talking about dis, and malinformation? The other problem is, what are we measuring in terms of impact when it comes to dis, and malinformation? And therein lies the problem that we at Maricopa County had along those lines. So, reducing mean time to discovery when we're talking about dis, and malinformation. So, going back to our Monte Carlo conversation, so if the independent variable is risk, what do we constitute as a threat in terms of dis, and malinformation? So my question back to you is, within your respective organizations, how does your organization define that risk? My guess is your organization probably doesn't have a finite, specific, and articulated way on describing what risk is in terms of dis, and malinformation, right? So in our research at Maricopa County, we did all the same things that you guys normally do. We Googled it, we put it in a ChatGPT, et cetera, et cetera. The closest thing that I could find in terms of any sort of guidance or framework was from CISA. And so in particular, the CISA reference was around election infrastructure insider threat mitigation. And so in that document, they do have some high-level descriptions about what constitutes an insider threat. So that's an important distinction. So a very focused description on that kind of threat. But really in the broader context of what constitutes a threat from dis, and malinformation as a whole, there isn't, to my knowledge. And if anybody is actually aware of that, by all means, please reach out to me because I'd love to see that. But to the best of my knowledge, there isn't an existing framework, certainly from an industry perspective, that provides some guidance along those lines. And so in our research, everything that we found online, everything we saw in NIST publications, CISA guidance, et cetera, nothing really met our need in terms of my ability to articulate, or our team's ability to articulate what constitutes a risk when it comes to dis, and malinformation. So as a starting point, this is what Maricopa County has put together with regards to a threat in general. So this statement is broad-reaching. It's not just focused on dis, and malinformation, but it needs to encapsulate that from our perspective. So is classified in various ways, can cause direct or indirect physical, reputational, financial injury, or death. Expression of intent to do harm or act out violently against someone or something. Threats can also be classified as a cyber threat that can exploit a vulnerability against a system or process for business or organization. And so there's a heavy emphasis on physical here, right? And so hopefully the beginning of this presentation outlined that, but just to give a little bit more context. Things have gotten so bad, and it's not that Maricopa County is unique in this way, but by way of context, after the 2020 election, the White House instructed the Department of Justice to create a task force specifically around ensuring the protection of elected officials and election staff. So the DOJ, working in conjunction with the FBI, has created that task force. Some of the things that you've seen over the last couple of years are examples of people actually being charged and prosecuted for those activities. And so I've had personally multiple conversations with the FBI around that. And so unfortunately, we're in a day and age where we find ourselves as a cybersecurity team, because we're doing threat hunting, we're searching for potential indicators of risk from a cyber perspective. We're seeing evidence of reputational attacks as well as physical attacks. And so as such, our definition of threat has had to be expanded significantly along those lines. So really, when we are talking about mean time to discovery, bottom line is there's no way that you're going to be able to reduce that discovery time period if you haven't even defined what's to be discovered, what constitutes a threat. And so, and again, from our perspective, we're looking at all sorts of threats. We're looking at cyber, we're looking at kinetic, reputational, and others. The environment in which the environment itself has a direct correlation on how difficult it is to determine whether something or not is a threat. So for example, if you see a barking dog like this one, I think it's pretty cut and dry as to what the nature of the threat is, what kind it is, and what the potential likelihood of said event is occurring. When you factor in the various different platforms that we all have to contend with in our jobs, that process becomes exponentially more difficult. And so really we're looking at a variety, and the threats come in different flavors and shapes. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the framework that we've internally developed along those lines. But based off of what gets posted, how it gets posted, who the intended audience is, it's all factors as to what may actually rise to be a credible threat against your organization. And so the platform itself, the environment itself, does play a direct role in terms of your ability to quantify what that risk is. And then if you want to have any sort of attempt or chance of being able to reduce that time for discovery is dependent upon your understanding of that environment. And again, my earlier point about data collection points and trying to objectively and quantifiably measure that risk, a lot of the data points are difficult, if not impossible, in some instances to collect. So let's take social media as an example. Other than X or Twitter, I believe they still sell back-end API access to posts that are publicly available. But other than that platform, other platforms such as Facebook, Instagram, as well as some of the other platforms out there, they don't allow machine access to what's posted online. And so your organization, Maricopa County's ability to collect those data points, it's almost like a needle in the haystack. So there are tools and processes that we use to try to get our arms around that. But honestly, in terms of having a consistent and holistic collection of data points for data elements that might constitute a threat, it's incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And so that's part of the challenge that we all face along those lines when it comes to misdis and malinformation. So what have we as an organization done about that? And then by extension, what might you be able to take back to your respective organizations on getting your arms around this problem? So really, we've gone back to the basics. So step number one for us was defining what a threat is and how to measure it, putting a form and structure around what constitutes a threat. We actively monitor traditional and social media for what we have defined as threats. And then based off of that, we update and practice our incident response plans along these lines. And so, not to deviate too much, but one of the things that we've discovered over the last 4+ years that we've been doing this as an organization is, while what's posted on social media might be an indication, well, I shouldn't say might, oftentimes is an indication of potential heightened cyber risk, Social media in particular, and traditional media by extension, is a better indicator of either reputational-based attacks or physical or kinetic events. So some of the things that I shared earlier in the presentation are tangible evidence that Maricopa County has experienced along those lines. So it behooves us as an organization to continue monitoring to the best of our ability social media. So two factors in particular, and before I go on, so for those of you in attendance, if you're interested in actually receiving a sanitized copy of what our documentation looks like as to what we constitute as a threat and how we measure that, reach out to me via email or LinkedIn, and I'm happy to share a sanitized copy. But I didn't want to necessarily make it just available to the masses to download. But if that's something that you're interested in, you want to take back to your organization, I'm happy to share that. But some of the highlights from that documentation and that framework we've developed is specificity and credibility. And so in our case, we're looking at things like, do they identify a particular target? So if they just say Maricopa County as a whole, that is not an indication nearly as much of a potential threat as opposed to unfortunately, some of our Board of Supervisors, Supervisor Gates, Supervisor Hickman, et cetera, or our recorder, Stephen Richer, they've received multiple threats online as well as verbally, and in some cases in person, along those lines. So the specificity matters. So are they targeting a specific individual or a group of individuals as opposed to the organization as a whole? Did it contain actualized statements? For example, I will, I am, we are going to, right? And so now some of this language and some of this, I guess, these standards, if you will, might sound familiar for those of you from a law enforcement perspective. Some of the tactics that we use have been borrowed along those lines. So, but I do want to be super clear here. Our purpose and focus is trying to ascertain credible threat. We're not trying to build a case from a legal perspective. We're not law enforcement, nothing of that sort. So our standards, our thresholds, and our methodologies, some of it might have some similarities, but it's not intended for the same purpose. All we're simply trying to do is measure threat. So just to be clear there. So additionally, was there a specific time frame provided? So did somebody on Facebook say, the next time I see you in public, or at your next citizen outreach event, or the next Board of Supervisors meeting, I'm going to show up and do X, Y, and Z, or something like that. And so we're looking for specificity along those lines. We also look at credibility as well, too. And so does the subject or the individual or the individuals involved, do they reside in a location that facilitates that? Are there indications that this person has access to weapons? And you might ask yourself, well, how the heck would we know that, right? It's amazing what people will post on social media. Let's just leave it at that. And do they have a known history of previous activities, right? And again, it's amazing what the memory is of the internet is. And so, but before I go on, so you might be asking yourself now, hey, this sounds like Maricopa County is targeting or stalking individuals. And so this is a very sensitive point that we're very conscious of. And so from my team's perspective, we do not, quote unquote, follow individuals, we follow accounts. And the distinction is pretty clear in that we will look for accounts on various different social media platforms, and if they exhibit behavior that might be of a threatening nature, whether it's cyber, kinetic, reputational, whatever the case is, we'll follow those accounts. We don't enrich that data and for purposes of trying to identify what their real identity is and correlate that with the account. That's not our intent. We don't do that. And part of it, too, is we recognize the thing that we're trying to fight against is what people are also accusing us of in part, which is being Big Brother, being a government agency and trying to keep tabs and deny people their right to free speech. We're not doing that. We're not keeping tabs on individuals. But conversely, we've taken the position that we as a security team and organization, we have an obligation to protect our organization and the people in it as well. And so that's where we draw the line, and we delineate between accounts and individuals. So we don't have a watch list of individuals, nothing of that sort. So we also take into consideration the type of threat. Obviously, direct threats are the most prevalent, or I shouldn't say prevalent, the most concerning, if you will, because if somebody is directly threatening you or your organization, that's something to take seriously. There's also indirect threats. We tend to see, honestly, on social media in particular, more of the indirect and veiled threats, right? And so this is why earlier I delineated between law enforcement and legal action, and then just measuring and trying to quantify risk, right? And so from a legal perspective, there are certain thresholds that you have to meet in order to have charges brought against you. While, we are trying to measure risk, that's not our intent, that's not our objective, that's not our role. We're not law enforcement. We're just trying to ascertain where the risk is to the organization. And so more often than not, you see indirect and veiled-based threats. There's also conditional that we tend to see, which is using elections as an example, if you certify the election, we're going to do X, Y, or Z, that sort of thing. So obviously we pay attention to that. And then the last one that I want to include is threat fragments. And so part of the challenge too is when it comes to quantifying risk on social media in particular, the sum is greater than the part of the whole, if you will. And so in that, what we tend to see is threat fragments on either at multiple times and sometimes on multiple platforms. So each of those threats singularly don't really rise or reach the level that we consider that a true threat, and that we need to enact different processes or protocols to address, right? But when you take those in aggregate across multiple platforms, across multiple times, especially if it's coming from the same account, things of that sort, then there's a different calculation that's applied. So that yet adds another level of complexity with regards to how we measure threats as a whole. So just checking on time. So what's the threat litmus that we've established for our team? So we've already talked about the specificity, we've talked about the credibility of a threat. And then specific to Maricopa County, what we've done is three of four of those qualifications need to be met in order for us to consider it a credible threat. And so the way we delineate credible threat is once it hits that threshold, then we enact certain processes. And so I'm not going to give too much of our toolkit, if you will, but some of the more obvious ones is a dissemination of information to the appropriate parties within our organization, right? The affected, if it's a targeted individual, so unfortunately we've had to have multiple conversations with folks from our recorder's office about here's the threat we're seeing. I will say the people we do keep track of is our own employees. So if there's a credible threat against an individual within Maricopa County, they go on a watch list for us where we have a heightened awareness, and we continue to look for evidence that they're being targeted, if you will. So that way we know if that threat's increasing, if it's decreasing, et cetera, et cetera. So, and then obviously when we see credible threats, based off of that in conjunction with other factors, we may disseminate that to our fusion center in the state of Arizona as well. So we also allow our analysts the ability to override the qualifications, so that 3 of 4 criteria based off of their perceptions. And so this is not an exact science, obviously. We have a lot of challenges. If you were to look at this process from a statistical perspective, there's plenty of holes. So I don't want to come across like we have this figured out, and from a statistical perspective, it can stand on its own. And so we still leverage the experience and the knowledge that our analysts have along those lines. And then internally within the organization, we have senior security operation analysts and my DCIO, CISO, oh, I just promoted him apparently, he's the CIO now, over SecOps, and to provide additional guidance. And this is important too, because threats, and so this is a concept that we all inherently understand, but I think in the topic of misdis and malinformation, it's also seasonal in nature. So we're obviously in an election year, so our threat tolerance and thresholds are significantly lower than they would be maybe at other times, right? And so, so we allow the analysts a lot of leeway along those lines, but we do have this threshold in place. And so, let me go back here. So the benefit of going through this process, you might be asking yourself, this seems like a lot of work for relatively low payback. So one thing I would encourage you to take in an account is us as an organization. So we're constantly being accused of infringing upon rights, things of that sort. By having this framework in place objectively and being able to document and show evidence of what we found and what our methodology is, we are able to more objectively defend what it is we do and why we're doing it and how we're doing it, right? Number two, we have limited resources, and so we need to be objectively selective to the degree possible about how we apply those resources. And so by having this framework in place, it allows us to more efficiently allocate those limited resources that we have to actual credible threats. And then lastly, I think this is more of a benefit for our intelligence partners. So we communicate regularly with the state of Arizona, disseminating IOCs, whether it's cyber, kinetic, whatever the case is. So when somebody receives an IOC from us, especially around misdis and malinformation, they know the fidelity of the information is significantly higher than from anybody else that they're getting it from, because we have our criteria in place, we've met those thresholds, and we can articulate and demonstrate evidence of why we believe that's a heightened risk. So this is the benefit to us as an organization. I suspect that you could make an equal argument for your respective organizations as well. So what now? So based off of what rises to a threat, regardless of the type, we then begin threat hunting, documentation, and reporting. Unfortunately, we don't have time to discuss that, but I'm happy to discuss online with you some of the tactics we take. So the sound bites that hopefully you take away from the talk today, this matters to everybody. Government's not the only one that has to deal with misdis and malinformation. There's so many examples out there on the internet of organizations such as like companies that are pre-IPO that got clobbered on social media and that affected their evaluation, for example. That's just one of a million different examples. Traditional social media is a threat vector and source of intelligence. Hopefully you've taken that away. You've seen examples, at least at Maricopa County's, from Maricopa County's perspective, that people are planning, people are threatening. They're planning from a logistics perspective on social media. They're threatening individuals, they're threatening organizations, they're attacking the reputation or the brand or brands out there on social media. And it's not just limited to government. And we need a way to delineate what is considered a threat on traditional and social media. And if you don't do that, then anything else that you want to try to do, whether it's reduce mean time to discovery for media threats, share intelligence in a way that invokes trust, none of that is possible. And so an example that I want to share with all of you, I attended a conference where the FBI was in attendance, and somebody had asked the FBI agent, well, what constitutes a threat and what should I report to the FBI? And so the FBI, basically their response, not a criticism, but their response was share everything with us. And so on one hand, we all instinctively know that that's not really the best approach, right? Because they already get so much white noise as it is. All they're going to get is a flood of people saying, I saw this nasty post on social media, which is all of our constitutional right, right? But at the same time, as the FBI, they can't go on record and say, don't send this, but send this, because then they would be held from a liable perspective, right? And so we, as cybersecurity professionals, we need to come up with a better way to delineate what the true risk is, because this problem's not going to go away. I believe organizations are going to find themselves more and more interested, if for no other reason, even if physical threats are not a concern of your organization, reputational attacks will be on everybody's mind. And I think that's going to be a growing area in our respective domain. So with that being said, I have 4 minutes and 29 seconds to answer questions, or we can take it in the wrap-up room. So thank you very much. And if you do have questions, there are mics set up in the middle of the aisle. So.
Since you're using a framework and you've developed a system to measure the risk from the, the MDM, were you able to use this to defend it against, any kind of court cases based on accounts? Because you said you're not targeting individuals, you're targeting accounts. So let's say you identify an account that's a threat, and that account owner comes back and sues you and says, "Hey, you're impinging on my constitutional rights," right? Were you able to use it to defend yourself in court in any cases or examples?
So I didn't catch all of that, but I want to summarize. So have we used the information that we shared about our monitoring accounts, and have they gone to court cases? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
So the truth of the matter is, I'm not aware if it has. And so to that point, so our involvement is limited to, we'll disseminate that intelligence to our state fusion center. That gets distributed to the appropriate parties, including law enforcement. And then if necessary, if it gets to a court level, then there will be subpoenas where records will be generated, et cetera, et cetera. But I will say, in terms of people stating that we're trampling on their constitutional rights, we're just monitoring social media that's publicly accessible. We don't cross that line in terms of private or anything else of that sort. So it's freely available. We have the same access as anybody else. And then on top of that, we never do that correlation from an identity perspective. So really, from our perspective, we've not broken any laws. We haven't impugned upon their constitutional rights as a result. Whether they've been used in court cases or not, I can't honestly tell you that because I haven't been involved in those. So, yeah. Next question.
You mentioned the MDM threats being assessed by your SecOps team. Are those members full-time MDM analysts, or is that something you're looking to add, or how do you work that into your traditional?
Right. So our monitoring of misdis and malinformation, specifically on social media, is through our SOC team. That is not a 24/7 service, and so there is some lag along those lines. But unfortunately, we don't have the resources to have people doing that full-time, 40 plus hours a week. And so it's a rotation basis. So we have roles. We have a protocol within our ops team. So different people have different roles. So somebody's monitoring social media, somebody we're affectionately call watching the wall, right? And then endpoint, network, all the other traditional sorts of things. And then we have an incident response protocol specifically around key type of events. So we have one specifically around elections. And so then we shift our focus, and then we do those sort of things. We're not looking at necessarily adding additional resources on that, because at some point, the juice has got to be worth the squeeze from a cost perspective, right? And so, yeah, it's kind of a difficult conversation, but yeah, so that's pretty much the gist of that. Yep.
Sir.
Yes, sir.
I have a question. So you told that you are observing the user's social media things, right, for the intelligence. So does it affect their privacy?
No. So this will be the last question, and then any other ones we'll take to the wrap-up room. So the reason why it doesn't impact anybody's privacy is because our intelligence gathering and research is only limited to publicly accessible platforms. And so anything that you post publicly on social media is what we're searching for. We don't attempt to get into private chats, conversations, forums, things of that sort. Because at the end of the day, we're not law enforcement, we're a government agency. Part of what we're trying to do is build citizen trust. And last time I checked, trying to do nefarious things like that would diminish that trust. And so So that's the balance that we've struck. So we only access information that's publicly available, so that way we can be aware of what risk is posed to the organization. Now, I will say it's amazing what people will post online, especially when they're anonymous. And so some of the stuff that we find is just incredible. And so honestly, we don't have to resort to any sort of underhanded tactics. We see plenty.
But if needed, would you use the CALIA, like the Communication Enforcement Law and Entitlement Act, the CALEA?
So I need to wrap up, so let's
Yeah.
take this offline if
Okay,
we
yeah.
can. So, but thank you very much.